Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. I am joined by Terminal Philosophy to discuss part 4 in our series on the history of warfare, the Assyrian Empire. Now, the innovations of the Assyrians are really sort of many. The first is that they had the earliest recorded large-scale standing army. They had the first confirmed widespread use of iron weapons. They revolutionized mounted warfare by the introduction of horse cavalry into sedentary empires and their invasions and siege warfare. So, where we left off in the period after the Sea Peoples, the Middle Assyrian Empire was still essentially a militia force. Now, because of its situation in the geography of the Near East, it was in near constant warfare. So they were probably even in that period some of the finest fighters in the world because of their constant military readiness with barbarians and nomads from the north. But we then see the beginning of a professionalized standing army. And with Tiglath-Pileser III, we see a core bodyguard of 1,000 men, which is the nuclei of the standing army. And the height of Assyrian power, they could probably muster 200,000 men on it for a campaign. And what we see, though, now is for the first time these large mass armies, which we talked about in our last episode on the Iron Age, which iron allowed the introduction of this kind of fighting. So if we look at, say, the battles of earlier eras like Megiddo with Thutmose and the Canaanites and Kadesh with Ramesses and the Hittites, we see that these are relatively small affairs where chariots and nobility are the decisive elements of the engagement. Now with the Assyrians, we have these gargantuan armies that can just swallow up people and cities and whatever. And what made that army so successful in part was the army of bureaucrats and logisticians that allowed for a supply chain network, roads, communication, and organizational practice. So that's sort of like the under the hood secret to Assyrian military dominance. And when looking at the big picture of Assyrian strategy, one of the motivating reasons for their expansion out from northern Iraq was to acquire iron deposits. While iron is a common ore, it wasn't very common in Assyria. And so that was what they needed to make their army as effective as it was. So in part, it grew to meet that demand, and as well to consolidate trade networks that crisscrossed the Fertile Crescent, which were, of course, used through taxation to subsidize the empire. And the innovations that the Assyrians brought also were on the strategic level, and from there we'll work our way down to smaller pieces. It was the use of psychological warfare and terror. So they would, if a city refused to surrender to the Assyrians, it would be leveled to the ground. The male population would be executed in some of the most grisly ways imaginable, having your tongue cut out, having your skin flayed off you. The women and children will be sold into slavery. And yeah, it was pretty much over. A classic example of this strategy is what happened to the kingdom of Elam. Elam was essentially just wiped off the face of the map, and there's no record of it afterwards. It's just completely gone. And the other aspect that the Assyrians introduced on this sort of strategic level was the idea of forced relocations. So the Assyrian king Adad-Nirari I in the Middle Assyrian kingdom began the process of relocating settled peoples into other parts of the empire. And this was during their war for independence against the Mitanni Empire. And they would then move in and settle with either Assyrians themselves or people from other parts of the world. And of course, what this does is it disrupts people's sense of identity, makes it much more difficult for them to operate, much more difficult for them to organize resistance against you. Right? You might know your own country like the back of your hand, but if you moved 500 miles away to the borders of the empire, you have no idea where you're at, which is greatly basically deracination was a weapon where they would deracinate people in order to control them. And using psychological warfare with terror and deracination techniques were, at least in the written records, not used before. And this is the first time we find in written records this. And of course, the terror of the Assyrians is universally recounted across the spectrum: the Bible, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. Nobody really liked the Assyrians. And in many ways, that's some of their most lasting contributions, was the sort of terror they struck in the minds of people. Even today, when we think of terror, we think of the Assyrians and the Mongols and the Soviet Union and things like that. And so on the strategic level, rapid movement of forces supplied by a competent logistical staff with spy networks throughout the target nations they were going to attack, with a large, probably, this isn't, I haven't really read specifically about this, but it's quite likely that the Assyrians outnumbered their opponents most of the time, because they could throw into the field vast armies that most other nations just were completely incapable of producing. And so they also had the weight of numbers on their side as well. Plus, you back that up with the training and tactics and weaponry that we'll get to in a moment, and the terror that was instilled by their atrocities. And little wonder that, in less than a century, they conquered, the entire Fertile Crescent and were pushing into Asia Minor. So terminal philosophy, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. It's definitely true to say that Assyria was really the first formal military in history because it was so dynamic and it had various specialized units within the army. I mean, for example, we talked about different categories where you have infantry and cavalry, and you also had chariots as well. You had chariots about up until probably the end of the 9th century BC. But it's true to say that all the information that we really have from Assyria's imperial prime is basically from the discovery of the library at Nineveh, and I think that took place in the 19th century. I'm not sure on the date on that, but it was. This is where we find so many descriptions of battles. You talked earlier about Elam being sort of this this smaller city-state down by the modern, what would this be, Western Iran, I believe. In the Battle of Susa, that was discovered on a tablet from the library, and basically what happened there was just like this horrible sacking. I mean, you have the Assyrian victory over the Elam capital, and he destroyed the ziggurat there, the copper horns that accented it. I mean, all the men were killed, all the women were sold into slavery. He took all the gold, and that was basically the end of the Elam Empire, or the city-state, and they never really emerge again. Assyria, you also are correct to identify Tiglath-Pileser III, and it was really under his reforms, such as agriculture and sort of this internal revamping of functions of an empire. For example, I mean, he sort of made the first formal postal service, and he also had his own intelligence corps. Assyrian government became effective enough that vassal rulers could increasingly be done away with, and conquered lands have become more directly ruled provinces under Assyrian governors. and they were also themselves subject to, spot checks by roving inspectors from Nineveh. So not only did you have like a really dynamic military with specialized units, but you had the system to support it. And what you and I will probably come to agree on later on is that it's not so much Assyria's incapabilities of military that made them conquered. Well, yes, but it's really that they developed this horrible reputation for this, ubiquitous affinity for decapitating and flaying and cutting people's tongues out and having these mass deportations as well. Mass deportations were popular under the Assyrians, at least by Tiglath-Pileser in the 7th century BC, and where it's believed that something like 220,000 people were resettled under him alone. And the reason why they did that, it's believed, was because they wanted to undermine local loyalties and identities of the people that they had conquered. But again, as we'll come to discover centuries later in the 6th century BC, that a lot of these people didn't have an Assyrian identity themselves and probably didn't care as to what happened to the emperor. And so that is probably one contributing factor to what led to the Assyrian downfall.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the actual military innovations on a tactical and operational level that made the Assyrian army such a war-winning force was, first and foremost, its use of iron. This is the first large-scale systematic use of iron for both protection and weapons in the written accounts. And the Assyrian army, armed forces, could be divided into, well, essentially 3 groups: the infantry, the mounted forces, and siege forces. The infantry forces could be subdivided into 3 categories: spearmen, archers, and slingers. And if we look at the spearmen often had an iron conical helmet, a small iron round shield, or a wicker shield, lamellar armor. And lamellar armor is essentially a jerkin that has metal little plates sewed into it, so you look like you're covered in fish scales. And the innovation of the hobnail boot. And this boot that was a key factor in the mobility of the Assyrians. It allowed them to effectively march over all sorts of terrain, from parched deserts to marshy swamps, protecting the feet of the infantrymen very effectively. And while many of these sources that I've read argued that the Assyrian spearmen fought in a phalanx style formation, I find that very dubious, because when the Persians, well, the Medes and then later the Persians, fight the Greeks, they don't use hoplites, and if they had fought the Assyrians and who were allegedly using this formation, I find it inconceivable that a military reformer like Cyrus the Great would not use that. And the fact that Cyrus the Great didn't use that probably means that the Assyrian infantry, much like later Persian and Arabic infantry, fought in loose, open order formations, again, primarily to reduce the effect of the damage and effect of enemy missiles coming in. The key focal point of the Assyrian army was its archer corps, armed with composite bows with deadly iron-tipped arrowheads. They could deliver withering volleys on enemy formations that this people just couldn't stand up to. The slingers were more of a niche unit, and they were used more for siege warfare, for plunging fire, where you could throw the rock up and over the wall into the enemy formations. And then the second grouping is the cavalry formations. So you have the chariot corps, which in many ways the chariot was much like the Egyptian chariot. It had a carriage with 2 men, a driver, and an archer. Though the carriage was of a more robust, heavier construction than the Egyptians, making it, on the one hand, more durable, but on the other hand, less mobile. And then later on, a 3rd man was added with a wicker shield in order to provide cover against incoming enemy missile fire. And likely under the influence of nomadic steppe peoples, the Assyrians are the first people to use mounted cavalry as we know it, dispensing completely with the chariot cart and all the other accoutrements. Now, the obvious benefit is that you have a better distribution of ratio from men to horses rather than 3 men for every one, every 4 horses. You have 1 man for 1 horse. And because you don't have a carriage, you can dispense with the logistics of wheel repair, axle repair, and all these other things that would have had to go along with chariots. So they're much less logistics intensive, and they're more mobile. They can operate more effectively than chariots can. And the cavalry were organized into 2 fashions: the lancers and horse archers. The lancers were generally equipped in a similar fashion to the Assyrian spearmen, and they would engage in a shock combat, a charge into enemy formations to break them up. Or alternatively, they could resort to a composite bow, firing those deadly iron-tipped arrows into enemy formations to disrupt them. And a general battle plan would be having the foot archer battalions march forward, covered by the wicker shields of the spearmen, to pour volleys into enemy formations, possibly being harassed on the flanks by chariots and cavalry archers. And then the charioteers would dismount, engage in shock combat against the disrupted formations, and the enemy, and then the Assyrian spearmen as well would close in to finish the disrupted formations. And that would be a sort of standard Assyrian tactical procedure. So, what do you think? You have anything to add, terminal philosophy, about the foot and mounted forces of the Assyrians?
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to say is that it's the Assyrians still used chariots, but probably only as late as the mid 8th century BC. But this is where we really see, for all the reasons you just mentioned, that cavalry was just so dynamic and could solve so many problems on a battlefield. For example, it was just so much more mobile and far less logistically intensive to maintain than a chariot. Chariots, again, from what evidence is available, chariots were still used, and they were simply reduced to a combat only role, probably as late as mid 8th century BC. But again, you get really dynamic options on the battlefield for when you have a trained and disciplined cavalry unit. A lot of the times, it's believed that cavalry and chariots and cavalry were used to distract and sort of fragment up certain forces, where if you have these big flanking maneuvers from fast cavalry, well, the opposing commander might think, well, we need to cover certain flanks by sending infantry over there so that we're covered. Well, in that process, in a typical ancient and medieval warfare process, you end up dividing your forces, and you create a lot of problems for yourself. And this is something that the Assyrians really mastered, and where they appeared to have a really good use of cavalry was in fighting the Urartu to their north. This is around Lake Van and Lake Urmia. This is just west of the Caspian Sea's southern coast. They were destroyed by Sargon II in 704, and there's evidence there, archaeological evidence, to suggest, along with finding just tons of iron-tipped bows, there was some accounts that there was, or what we believe to be the best accounts from these clay tablets from the library, that cavalry was used against the sort of nomadic and sort of decentralized and unorganized forces of Urartu at Tushpa. So that's another interesting battle site. But yeah, again, and then you have the dynamic use of archers as well, where you have slingers and you have archers, and it's believed that slingers were used in a similar sort of role, where they were used to distract forces where they didn't have shields. Archers would then, fire at the forces that are focused on the slingers, and slingers are throwing rocks, and that can be more disruptive initially than just protecting yourself against arrows. So they had a good way of fragmenting the forces, the opposing forces' attention. And again, if the Assyrians only had one or two types of units on the battlefield, they probably wouldn't have been as successful as they did in their conquest. But because they had so many specialized roles within the army, and really, this is, they're the best evidence that we have as far as any empire anywhere on Earth to have so many different types of roles. They had a historic enemy of like the Aramaic and Aramean tribes of basically what would be, I guess you could say, central Syria and just west of the Euphrates. A lot of these tribes would end up forming sort of petty states and kingdoms, but Assyria would always come through, and they have accounts of like something like 10 annual campaigns, and I think that was under Tiglath-Pileser III against the Aramean tribes at Tadmor and as far west as Phoenicia. Those people were put down brutally, and again, it's through this this really heightened affinity for decapitations and flaying and enslavement and so on and so forth. But Assyria can really owe its military successes just due to having so many different types of specialized units focused on one or two tasks alone that made the broader army more successful.
Yes, and the most specialized units of all were the siege corps, and the Assyrian siege corps really is the first time that we have what one might consider a scientific application of principles to siege warfare, where now we have a systematic, consistent application here. And prior to the Assyrians, siege warfare generally revolved around trying to starve a city out, trying to scale it with ladders, the walls, trying to build an earthen rampart to scale the wall, and sappers to dig underneath the walls to weaken them. But the Assyrians invented two new weapon platforms. And under Ashurnasirpal II, we have the earliest recorded use of battering rams. And the Assyrian battering ram it has this sort of self-enclosed frame covered with ox hide to protect the men inside, and then they wield a ram with an iron tip to pound down walls and gates, and it was extremely effective at breaking enemy fortifications, as well as the siege tower, which the main use of the siege tower is to, when you attack an enemy city, archers and slingers and later on catapults on the walls have the height advantage, and they can throw missiles down on your heads and do tremendous damage. So the siege tower is a sort of mobile firing platform which allows you to fire over top the wall of the city you're besieging, which allows you to fire into the city, maybe lighting things on fire with fire arrows, or sweeping the walls with missile fires so that the enemies will not attack your troops coming up with rams and scaling ladders. And also as a way to deposit troops up from the tower onto the wall directly. And the Assyrians pursued a strategy more akin to, rather than waiting out a siege, storm or assault, where they would rapidly depress the men on the walls, suppress the men on the walls, so that they could then march in and batter down the walls or march over them with the siege towers. The siege of Lachish in the early 8th century BC is a famous example of Assyrian siegecraft, and the city ultimately fell to an earthen rampart. But we see all of these panoply of Assyrian siege techniques brought to bear. And it's really this combined arms aspect of the Assyrians, combining cavalry with infantry, with siege weapons, with subdivisions within each of those, which allowed for this rapid growth. From around the time of Tiglath-Pileser, the empire just ballooned outward at very rapid pace. And when we look at, say, an earlier era in the Neo-Assyrian Empire during the Battle of Karkar in 853, where a coalition of Syrian kings and Israel fight the Assyrians, it's not a lot of details on the battle itself. While the Assyrians claimed victory, none of the kings who fought the Assyrians were deposed, so it was likely, at best, a stalemate, since they stayed on the throne, which almost surely they would not have had the Assyrians won. And the fact that they were defeated by a sort of ragtag coalition would indicate to me that these reforms and this well-oiled machine really is the creation of Tiglath-Pileser. Because when he breaks into Syria and Israel, it's just a blitzkrieg, it's a whirlwind. And so I would say that while these reforms are ongoing, even in the 9th century BC and much of the 8th century BC, we probably don't see all of this until we get to the armies of Tiglath-Pileser II and Sargon II and Ashurnasirpal.
Yeah, exactly. And with Tiglath-Pileser the third, after his death, there was what can be considered a civil war, and it's believed to be 722. Tiglath-Pileser's son and successor, Shalmaneser V, was overthrown by civil war from Sargon II, and this was more or less from 721 to 705. This is when the reputation, I think, started to catch up. This is the beginning of where it started to catch up with the broader Assyrian Empire. This is where rebellion really broke out across the empire. However, they were still easily defeated ultimately, except that in Babylon, which, because it was supported by the sorry, is it Elamites? Elamites? Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
butchering. Yeah, it took Sargon 10 years to to suppress that, and Sargon really ended the main threat to Assyria's northern border by destroying Urartu. Now, where Assyria really reached its greatest extent, again due to its occupational practices and its dynamic military force. Um, that would be under the ruler of Ashurbanipal, who conquered Egypt, and he was also responsible for conquering Elam. So, and again, he really just exacerbated this reputation for decapitations and flaying and so forth. Um, what he ended up doing was that, even though against the backdrop of Assyrian brutality, he ended up being one of their more cultured rulers, as he built the vast library of cuneiform tablets at Nineveh. And however, his conquests ultimately overextended themselves, and what basically ended up happening was that by the Battle of Carchemish, this is where I don't believe he was alive at that point, but this is really the end. That's sort of the final battle of Assyrian forces, as far as this coalition goes, where you had the Egyptians and remnants of the army of former Assyria versus the coalition that, maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but this will be with the coalition of Babylonia and the Medes from modern day Iran. And again, it's not so much that Assyria was defeated for having a lacking army. It's because it's kind of similar to the Wehrmacht and the Waffen SS and some of their more what would you say, just draconian events that took place there. It's sort of what happened there. They lost the support of these local populations, and it ended up creating this sort of coalition that ended up destroying them. And you also have, which I'm sure you'll be able to touch on, is the Scythian raids from the north, and these are really the people of the steppe and the originators of the chariot. So they had come down in raids from the Caucasus Mountains, and they conquered, or would raid at least, as far west to central Anatolia, to all the way southeast to the southern coast of the Caspian Sea. And they really became a perpetual problem, as they more or less had the military tactics and mentality of the ancient sea peoples, or much later on the Vikings. It's not that they had this great formal empire with these like sprawling city states and some powerful economy and trade routes and all this and that. They were more of just nomadic peoples of the steppes that had been there already for centuries. And they really just had this striking capability due to the use of cavalry and chariots, and they didn't have any sort of plans to take over and have this great empire established. They just wanted to come in and raid and take what they wanted and be done with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and when we look at the pacification techniques of the Assyrians and the brutality that it incurred, arguably it backfired and was singularly ineffective, because throughout the Neo-Assyrian period, Babylon is revolting and changing hands, I don't know, half a dozen times it seems. And ultimately, it's Babylon that does bring down the Assyrian Empire completely and with the siege of Nineveh in 612. But we see that it ended up creating more enemies than they could handle. And furthermore, while they're either engaging in civil wars or internal pacification, two threats arise on their borders. To the north are the Scythians, and to the east are the Medes. And the Median Empire is really vast. It stretches from the Caucasus to the Indus, and it really almost rivals the Assyrian Empire in size. And Assyria is constantly over the century-long expansion and suppression from around 710 to 610 BC. The Assyrians are, one would have to imagine, a great level of attrition of their greatest fighters, where as their enemies accommodate and adopt some of the principles and tactics of the Assyrians are less effective than before because of attrition on the actual troops. And it would seem that the Scythian raids, which began around 632 BC, targeted mostly the rich core of the Assyrian Empire. Herodotus in his histories writes that they just laid waste to Syria and northern Iraq. Some of the outlying areas seem to have been spared, though they did as well penetrate down to Egypt. And they were only defeated by the Medes, who, according to Herodotus, got them all to drink poison wine. And so that got rid of most of them. But at the time, though, they completely decimated the Assyrian Empire. And this is the beginning of a trend that we'll begin to see throughout history, that the nomadic peoples of the steppe with their horse archers will time and time again annihilate forces, divisions, and units of sedentary empires. The combination of mobility and firepower was just too great for most nations to deal with adequately. And the Median Babylonian campaign is really more of a mopping up campaign. The Assyrian Empire is a shell. It doesn't really it exists on paper in the sense that, well, people are used to this. People are afraid of the Assyrians. They've paid tribute to the Assyrians, but the Assyrians really at this point have no means of imposing their will on these people such that the empire could be maintained. And it would only be a matter of time before they be joined in a coalition against nations that they had burned before, or in the case of Media, a new nation, the new kid on the block, as you will. And one might speculate that given that many of the 10 tribes of Israel were relocated to the Median border, one wonders if the Israelites or the Ephraimites helped the Medes get into the Assyrian lands themselves. Maybe they had intimate knowledge of the terrain at this point. They'd been in captivity for well over 100 years at this point. And we see that shortly before the sack of Nineveh, at the Battle of Carchemish, an Egyptian force joins the Assyrians and is defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. So, what the picture that I like to paint is that the Assyrian army is likely exhausted, and even though it might still be competent, it's exhausted, it's outnumbered, it has more enemies than it knows what to do with. And the Babylonians and the Medians are working in concert. And of course, the resources of Media are vast, as are the resources of Persia, which we'll see when we get to the Achaemenid dynasty and Cyrus the Great's reforms. And so, within ancient history, generally speaking, the larger armies are going to win. Not always. Alexander the Great is an exception to that rule. But generally, if you have more men, you're going to win. And the Assyrians had bled themselves out, and the Babylonians and the Medes were able to marshal superior numbers and utterly destroy them. And the Assyrians, while as a people survived, the empire disappeared, and they were subject peoples ever after.
Yeah, I agree with all that. By the time Babylon came in by 612 with the siege of Nineveh, what was interesting is that this is really the emergence of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and where, in ancient warfare, it's oftentimes that two sides are fighting, and there's all of this there's this general conquest going on where cities are destroyed and agriculture is reduced, and then so whoever wins ends up having to rebuild all of this infrastructure and these systems in place. Well, one thing that's unique with the Babylonian conquest of Nineveh is that a lot of these cities were still intact, more or less. I mean, yes, they were still under sort of the brutal occupation of the Assyrians, but places like ancient Damascus and Ugarit and Haran and Ashur and Sharukin, sorry about that. These are some of these last few city states that I mentioned are along the Tigris and the Euphrates and Mari. All of these places just basically changed management under the Neo-Babylonians. And, just as for the Assyrians in this general sort of geostrategic sense, they really ended up just creating too many enemies. They ended up having, the Medes and the Persians. The Medes were basically on the northern side of the Assyrian frontier, where you have the Medes in the southern Caspian Sea, and then you have the Persians that are to the south by the Persian Gulf, and I'm sorry, the Medes would be north along the Caspian Sea, and you have the Persians further south along the Persian Gulf coastline. And really, you just had this formation of different coalitions going in. As for the Scythian raids, I don't know whether or not, even if Assyria had developed this reputation for being benevolent or something like that, I still think that the Scythian raids were probably an inevitability, because as you said earlier, these sedentary kingdoms and empires of this general historical epoch were subject to these raiding peoples of the steppe, and they had every reason, I think, to come down to do that, because they didn't have these huge city states to maintain and populations to feed. They were nomadic, so that was just sort of that was just a way of life for them, I think, and it was very much commensurate with just how they lived. But by the time Ashurbanipal's conquests had happened, Assyria was so greatly overextended, and a lot of his rule led to even more internal disorder. There's already internal disorders and uprisings under Tiglath-Pileser, and it really just kind of culminated in this conquest of Nineveh in 612. And by 609, the last Assyrian resistance had been basically reduced, and Assyria has basically disappeared from history at this point. But you have the Neo-Babylonians taking over as the dominant power in the area. I think from here on out, for the rest of history of warfare, you'll see this further sort of subdivision of dynamic military units. I mean, yeah, we could go on and on about the brutal treatment that the Assyrians did to all the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, but again, this being a history of warfare series, really, again, it just comes down to how they had so many different specialized units like siege troops. They had, several varieties of infantry and spearmen and swordsmen, as well as being equipped with iron, the first infantry formations with armor, and you have, several subdivisions within cavalry themselves. And even when they were using chariots, there's good evidence that they used chariots for at least three different things, like transport, for combat, and also just as general messengers throughout different empires of history. The Egyptians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, they all used chariots as more this logistical function as well. And as far as the logistics go, that's another reason why they're so successful. What I did find is that in some of the clay tablets, it's been reported that they found like these words that was roughly translated to arrow facility, something a traveling facility that would go along with the army. And what that just means is in essence that there was arrow manufacture and replenishment that was going along with the army. So they may have set up some sort of like tents or men that were dedicated just to creating ammunition for archers. And you had these things like hobnail boots, as you mentioned earlier, which were huge for these long, long marches. Because if you're from somewhere from Nineveh and you're on one of these conquests from even as early as Ashur-dan the second, all the way up to Ashurbanipal of the 6th century, if you want your troops to survive and be in fighting capability, then these sort of nail-headed looking boots were huge for that time. So again, from here on out, even all the way up to present day, I mean, you just see this further, like this more branching out. This further branching out of military units, and yeah, I think that's why they have the military reputation that they have up to this point.
Yeah, the legacy or the importance of the Assyrians for this series is that we see for the first time a standing professional army on a large scale. We see a combined arms system, and the Assyrian army shows how effective a well trained combined arms system can be if properly led. And one of the reasons why we don't see combined arms systems more in history is precisely how difficult it is to make them. You have to be either a very large empire or a very well managed kingdom to have the resources available to do that. But having done that, it gives you a tremendous amount of opportunities for expansion and for destroying your foes. And then, of course, siege warfare. This tradition of siege warfare that the Assyrians start is sort of carried on throughout the Semitic and Iranic peoples, with Persia and Carthage continuing this tradition long up until the classical era. In fact, one could argue that the eastern the heirs of Assyria, Carthage and Persia, were superior in the arts of siegecraft until Alexander the Great and the Macedonians, and then later the Romans. And so, they sat on this lead for 400 or 500 years, and that was again a huge contribution that the Assyrians had made. And in fact, knowledge of siegecraft entered the Greek world most likely through the roundabout route of Carthage, who they had in turn learned it from. Tyre had learned it from the Assyrians. So this legacy of sophisticated siege warfare, of combined arms operations, of the importance of logistics are all hallmarks that we'll later see with Alexander the Great and the Romans, Caesar, Scipio, Sulla, Marius. And really, we also have, for the first time, a good account of the makeup of an army formation. Whereas in this sort of proto or prehistorical period we've been in thus far, it's very difficult to figure out the unit composition of many of these ancient armies. And the Assyrians or the first time we have a clear account of this. Now, it could possibly be that there were other armies like this before, on a smaller scale, but not having any written records, we would have lost that. Possible. But we don't really know, and as far as we do know, the Assyrians were the first. And all the hallmarks of study of war and the practice of war that we'll get into in the series, the Assyrians have pretty much covered all the bases, all the starting points that we will refer to throughout the rest of the series. The Assyrians created. And as far as anything else, I think I'm finished. Is there anything you'd like to add, Terminal Philosophy?
No, yeah, just to reiterate, yeah, again, I think from here on out, you will see this, this expansion of dynamic military units in other empires. But yes, you're right to say that it's a real logistical challenge to achieve something where you can maintain a military with dynamic units. But again, it does provide opportunities for expansion, and it really varies up what you can do on the battlefield. As for what Warhammer is saying in the chat, he says, were the Assyrians the first to use camels in war? I'm not sure of that. But as to the second part of your question, you're saying that I'm pretty sure the age of the chariot was long since dead with new infantry and iron weapon tactics. I would say that that's true for the most part. The only thing I would say to that is that from the reading that I've done for this video, under the rule of Ashur-dan, which was again from 934 to 912, a lot of his conquests were used, at least what's available is that chariots were involved in those conquests, and they lasted again until, I mean, it's more or less agreed upon everywhere from Ancient Warfare magazine to just a lot of contemporary sources on military history from that time, is that chariots were used. They could have been used as late as 850 BC, but you have a good point in the sense that iron weapons sort of made them. Iron weapons helped to make chariots sort of obsolete, and really what it was is just the introduction of cavalry by the mid 8th century. They were just easier to maintain. But as far as anything else, no, I think I'm finished as well. Thanks, man.
All right, yeah. Thanks, Terminal Philosophy, for contributing. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.